So I'll get into now the first formula, how to build a reactive form. Um, so these aren't in any particular order, although you would want to make your form before you unit test it. But in general, so first I'll show how to create the templates with the directives. Then I'll show creating the data structures in TypeScript. And then I'll show validators, how to create custom validators and how to use the built-in validators as well. And finally, how to write unit tests for these. So step one, creating the HTML templates. We can do one of two things. We can use form controls directly on form elements like inputs or selects using the form control directive. So here I have the directive right on an input element, and I'm binding to it as an input with the square brackets, and then I'm assigning the instance of a form control from the TypeScript to that input. So the name in this case is first name control, and that would be an instance of a form control in the TypeScript. The other thing we can do is use the form group directive to associate an entire form group with a group of elements. So here, my top level form element, I'm attaching a form group to it with the form group directive, and this form group is called group. And then I have two input elements, each one with the form control name. So in this case, first name is a control inside of the form group, and the same is true for last name. And finally, there's a button to submit, and the disabled property is assigned to the opposite of group.valid. So whenever the group is not valid, the button will be disabled. Step two is to create the data structures in the TypeScript. And to do this, you can just create objects as you would any other object in TypeScript or JavaScript with the new keyword. And so we can see an example of that on the right, where I have first name control equals new form control, and then I pass in a default value. You can do this with form groups and form arrays as well. However, a slightly more convenient way to do it is to use the built-in form builder. This is a service that's built into the Forms API. And so you can inject it into your class in the constructor. And you can see that FB :form builder. And once you have the form builder, you can use it to create your form. So in this case, I am using fb.group to create a form group. And then I pass an object of key value pairs, where the keys are the names of the controls, and the values are an array of metadata about the control. So the simplest way to use it is to pass the default value. Okay. Step three is to add validators. So you can use the built-in validators. An example is validators.required. And so all of the built-in validators are available through the validators name in the @angular/forms import. And once you do that, you can use required. There's also min and max for numbers. And I believe there's a regular expression validator as well. I think there's also like email validator. And so if you have just one, you can pass that as the second item in the array for the control, as I've shown for first name. If you have more than one validator, you can pass them as an array. So in the second example for last name, I have two validators, the required validator, and then a custom validator called five_validator. And so these are synchronous validators, and so that means that they are just regular functions where the input property is a control, and the output is the validation for the control. So if you need a validator that works on form controls, the first parameter will be a form control. If it acts on an entire form group, the input would be a form group. And then the return type of the function should be a type of validation errors or null. And validation errors is really a record type. It's a type where you have a string, key name, and an object, and then some value. And so the idea here with validators is that if it returns undefined or null, then that's considered to be valid. Otherwise, if you return a validation error, which is just an object, then that's considered an error. And the Reactive Forms API will actually hold on to the key value pairs inside of that object and report them whenever you get errors from the form group. So if you did group.errors, it would give you these errors out, and you can detect which errors your form has. So if we look at 5validator in the upper right, we see that it takes a control as an input parameter, and then we're checking to see if the value of that control is not 5. And if it's not, then we return a validation error of verify 5, and we just assign it to true. If the value is 5, it implicitly doesn't return anything, so it returns undefined, and that's considered valid. You can also return null. And finally, there's a way to do asynchronous validators. So if you have, for example, a backend call that you would need to make, like you want to do validation against, if you want to do validation in the backend, which is a very common thing to do in many different form situations, you'd in general want to do this with an HTTP call, and that would have an observable response. And so you would get your response at some later time and then emit an object through an observable that represents the validation. So it has the same return type, except it's wrapped in an observable, and that allows you to asynchronously return it. And so a really simple example is this slow async validator, where I'm just returning I'm returning null after a delay of 1 second through an observable. So of is an observable that it's a function that ArcsJS gives you to create an observable that emits a single value and then completes. So in this case, it emits null and immediately completes. And I'm using the pipe method on the observable to pass in an operator. In this case, the delay operator, which just delays that value by however many milliseconds you pass. So this is just a really simple example of async validators, and like the synchronous ones, you can have more than one. So if you use an array, as I've shown in the last name example at the bottom, you can pass one or more async validators that way. Just want to make a quick point that validation can be done well or it can be done poorly. In general, you want to be user-friendly with your validation errors. You don't want to be too user-hostile in the way that you show it in your template. So this is an example from a recent trip that I had where the airline sent me a link to some information about my trip. And when I clicked the link on my phone, it brought up this screen where most of the inputs were marked as having errors, even though I hadn't touched the form yet. And you want to make sure that the user has a chance to do the right thing first before you tell them that they've done the wrong thing. In frameworks like Angular Material, the default behavior will wait until the user touches the control before it will show an error on the control. So the user has to, type in some values and then leave the control before it will actually show validation errors. And that's a really good way to make forms, since you don't want to immediately tell the user they've done something wrong when they haven't actually done anything yet. So it's just something to keep in mind. And so for the last step of this formula, we went to see how to write unit tests. So the validators we just saw are very easy to test because they're just functions. So we can create our own fake control objects and then pass them into the function and test the return values. In terms of testing the form itself, you can do something like I have on the right here. So I'm using the Angular test bed to create a fake ng module with all of the dependencies of the control. So in this case, Reactive Forms module is the only dependency, and then I declare the actual component that I'm testing. And then I can create the component with the testbed.createComponent method and get that instance with .componentInstance. And then I can manipulate that component however I want to. So there's no template actually being created, but the component, the template actually is is being created because I'm using the test bed, but I'm not directly doing anything with it. So in this case, I'm just using these public properties. So really, I'm just using the public property group, which is the form group. And so I can do an expectation on it. So in the first yellow highlighted line, I have expect component.group.valid to be false. So I'm expecting the group to be invalid to start with. And then once I enter the email and password, so I'm just setting the value on those controls. Form groups and form arrays both have a get method, and you can pass a path into that where it will try to get a control out of the group or the array. And so in this case, I'm getting the email control out of the form group, and I'm setting its value. I'm doing the same thing with password. And so after I do that, I expect my form to be valid, and so I can do the same sort of thing at the end. All right. I can also test async validators, and this kind of gets into how to test RxJS code in general. So I'm doing a similar thing with the test bed to create a fake ng module with my imports that I need. In this case, I'm just doing this to get the HTTP client testing module, the testing controller rather, and this allows me to mock out HTTP requests. This is all built into Angular, so I'm showing the imports at the top. And so I have my async validator function, which is going to async validator function, which is going to take a control, and I'm going to subscribe to it and expect a null response, which would be not an error. My async validator, which is not shown here, but it will actually need a way to get the HTTP client to do the asynchronous call, which is not shown here. But your async validator function will need some way to get the HTTP client. So you might have an async validator factory function, which would take the HTTP client, and then inside of that function, that would return a function that would actually be your async validator. But the point is that in the last 4 lines, we're showing how to mock out an HTTP request. So on that const request equals controller, expect one with the path. This is the path that the HTTP client will be called with. So if we do a get request with a path, that will be the same string. Then in the next line, we're expecting that the request method was a get. So we're expecting that the validator function will do a get request. We'll then flush. So this will actually send data through the HTTP client back to our async validator. So our test data would be the fake data coming back from the server. And then we call controller.verify to make sure that there are no more outstanding requests. And so the idea is that this code is not happening in sequence. So in the first line with the subscribe call on it, we're setting up a subscription on the observable, and that callback function, the fat arrow expect e.toBe null, which is right here. This is not going to call immediately. This will occur when we do the flush with the test data. And so once we do that, that will actually emit a value through the HTTP client inside the async validator, which will cause our validator to return a value at that point. So that's when this subscribe callback will be fired. All right. This is just a quick example of not exactly something that you could use with the HTTP test bed or the HTTP testing controller. Rather, this is a way to do in one line to get a value from a one-shot observable that will complete without you needing to do some code later. So this wouldn't work with the HTTP testing thing because we have to set up our subscription first and then flush it with the data later. But if we had an observable value like with NGRX store, for example, or if we had a behavior subject, we just wanted to get the value from it, Behavior subject isn't a great example because you can just get the value off of it. But if you had an observable that just gives you a value immediately when you subscribe to it, and you just want one value, for example, you can do that in one line using async await. So in this case, I am taking an observable and I'm piping it with take one. So what that will do is it will complete the observable after one item comes through the pipeline. I'm converting it to promise. This is built in to ArcsJS observables. And then I'm using async await to await the promise. And so that means I can use it in expect all in one line. And so I can do expect that to equal with a value. And so that's just a way to get the value of your observable all in one line. The alternative, using a subscribe, is several more lines and isn't quite as clear what's happening. It also leaves a subscription hanging if you don't pipe take one first. So this is just an example of something you can do. We use this a lot with the NGRX store to get values in our unit tests. Just makes them more concise.